Hey everyone, welcome back from break. I hope things are going well as you ramp up into your semester routines again. As a way of bringing together the first half of the class and kind of reminding us what we did over the previous 9 weeks, I want to respond to a number of your very excellent questions. You asked far more good questions than I can possibly get to in a reasonably length video. So I'm trying to group them into a number of categories, just a few categories of questions that I kind of saw variations on a theme on. And I think that'll be a great way of trying to give you a little bit more feedback and wrapping everything up from the first half. And everything we've done in the first half is going to be directly applicable to the second half. So I think this is a good way of getting started with our second part of the course as well. One of the biggest themes that showed up in your questions was some confusion or uncertainty, and very understandably so, about the difference between the past, history, and historiography. And I just want to say at the outset that these are confusing, okay? It took me a long time to internalize these. Like intellectually, I could memorize definitions and think, okay, this is this and this is this. But it takes a while to get used to it. And effectively, I'm basically asking you in this class to redefine your sense of what history is. You have used the past and history interchangeably, probably your whole life. And I'm asking you to stop, okay? Now look, the bottom line is we do use them interchangeably. People are always going to, you're going to, I do, our authors, Popkin and Mazza, have used them interchangeably. But for a historiography class like this, it's very important to be able to use them distinctly, right? Even if everyday conversation, we're going to use them interchangeably. It's important to understand how there are useful distinctions. Mike P., Teresa, Linnea, all really excellent questions on this point, and many of you referenced it as well. So let me summarize. This is how we started the class, but now that we've read a couple books and here we are much later, you've got a very different perspective on these things. So let me try to summarize it again. The past is what happened, okay? It's stuff that happened. And when you think about it, we have a very extremely limited view of what happened in the past. Whatever stuff gets saved in archives, photo albums, memento boxes, videos, oral histories, more recently, stone tablets, whatever the form, right? The very little of what happens in the world gets saved. Think of your everyday life. Almost everything you do is gone forever, every day. It's a little depressing. Don't worry about that. It's very little gets saved. So the past is what happened. We can think about that theoretically. We know stuff happened in the past, okay? But we have very little access to it in the present. History, as distinct from the past in terms of what happened, history, I'm saying, for the purposes of this class, are the conversations we have about the past. It's things we say happened, right? And obviously, they're really intertwined, right? You don't have conversations about the past unless you have a past, right? And conversations about the past have to be tied to things that happened, right? It's not just completely fiction. But it's conversations about the past. That's what history is. Again, we use them interchangeably, but for the purposes of this class, it's very useful to keep them, to understand the distinctions. Historiography, just to add to the confusion, because why not, means two different things. Literally, historiography, right? Two Greek words put together, the writing of history. That is literally the writing of history in the sense that, this is what I do as a professional historian. Well, this last year, not so much. But when I'm researching and writing and publishing stuff about history of food or history of medicine or whatever I'm doing, that's writing history. That's writing part of the conversation. It's joining the conversation, contributing hopefully some useful idea to what people are thinking and saying about the past. I can't change the past. The past happened, right? That's distinct from what I'm saying about it, which is my interpretation of what happened and what it means. So when I do my job, I am a historiographer, in a sense. But that's kind of a secondary meaning. The main meaning of historiography, the one that we use in this class, the one that Popkin puts in the title of his book, the subtitle, An Introduction to Historiography, is the study of history, a study of the conversations, how it's been written, how they've changed over time. Obviously, that's what Popkin's about. Mazza does the same thing in a different way, focused on the last 50 or 60 years rather than over all time. So again, we're going to use history in the past interchangeably. The authors do. everyone does. So we need to get used to that sort of ambiguity and that ambivalence, ambivalence, right? Literally two different meanings of the past and history. But for our class, it's good to be able to talk about the past and things that happened as distinct from the stories we tell about them, right? Which change over time. And historiography, which also changes over time, the study of the past, right? Because historiography is a kind of history. It's a conversation about conversations, right? It's kind of a meta conversation. Linnea asked a very good question. Why in a class quite literally entitled Making History have we been assigned more contemporary summations of historiography and historical writing? Why haven't we read much in the way of history if enrolled in a historiography class? And I think the answer really stems from some kind of the fact that these terms are so intertwined. We are reading history. Absolutely, we are reading history. We're reading the history of history, which is historiography, right? So we are reading about the past, how historians have written. The class isn't as much about the past in the sense of, wars and battles and kings and revolutions and so on, as you might get in some other classes. Obviously, our topic isn't a time period. It's not a geography. To think about some of Maz's questions, it's really what we're studying is history itself, right? The story of how conversations about the past have changed over time. Another theme that was very prominent in your questions was truth and objectivity. Kenneth asks, is there anything that can be learned from eras where history was written without a focus on truth? And I would say that we can learn from any era and learn from histories of any era because they've always pursued truth. All historians, I think, have pursued a truth. It's just that the idea of what is truth for different people at different times is always changing. Herodotus and Thucydides were very much interested in truth, but how they acquired it differed between the two of them, as we read about early on in Mopkin. That was a while ago. Popkin, as we read about a while ago. Early medieval truth in the Christian tradition was very different from sort of a Renaissance truth. Renaissance historical truth came from archival sources and critical text analysis. Enlightenment truth from universal histories. Ronchian truth was more scientific, and so on. So different historians, different eras have had different versions of truth, but I would say that they've always pursued what they thought was the most interesting and useful version of truth. And we can learn a lot about ourselves by looking at how other people did it. Other people have done history because it shows us how we're doing our history in our own particular way. And that 100 years from now, historians and people in general are going to look back at the histories that we now think are very useful and very interesting and say, nah, not so much. Just as we look back 100 years and say, what can we learn from those historians? And the answer is not a lot necessarily. With some important exceptions. But in general, the way we do history, the methods have changed. What we establish as objective or truth or bias, those things are different. Why we do history is different. Who is it for? Different. So obviously the narratives are constantly changing. Chris asked, can modern historiography be used to sway a misinformed population or simply fit one's narrative? Yes, absolutely. I think this is what we typically know as politics. Relatedly, Teresa wrote, I feel like politics takes advantage of innocent historical events and uses it as propaganda for their own campaigns, and politicians have control of historical events. This is absolutely right. And I think this is a great way of highlighting the interrelatedness between history and politics. I think anyone who tells you or criticizes someone for playing politics with historical events or something that's happened is just ridiculous. You should ignore them. Criticizing Group X for using something for political gain. That's the game. That's what politics is. It's taking recent events, which are now history, very recent history, and creating a narrative about them and explaining why they mattered, why they happened, and what we should do about it. That's what politics does, right? Whether you think it's a terrorist attack or immigration or social justice or public education or gun control or whatever issue you're interested in, you when things happen, you use it to understand what we should do in the future, right? That's politics, that's history. You're creating a narrative about the past. That's what historians do. It tends to be further back in time. But it's the same kind of thing. And so, yes, politics and history are very, very closely related. That's one reason I think history is such a great major, because you learn to think about how people create, control, maintain, and change, modify, revise narratives about stuff, whether it's ancient history or whether it's history from yesterday. It's the same process, right? Sources are a little different, methods are a little different. Obviously, politics and history are different sort of disciplines in that sense, but you can see there's a tremendous amount of overlap between what we've been doing in this class and what happens in politics and journalism every day in terms of creating and controlling narratives. What recommendations do you have for a novice to spot historical bias or narrative bias or bias for storytelling, i.e. the tendency to craft appealing popular stories from historical fact? I'd say, and this is directly related to this question about what do we see in politics and journalism every day, find a correlation between argument and broad representative evidence. If people are telling you what happened in the past, or people are telling you what happened in contemporary events, if they can't give you specific examples and argue why those specific examples are general examples at the same time, don't listen to them. They're just saying what they want to be true. If people can't give you specific evidence and point to an array of evidence and explain why it's significant, they don't know what they're talking about. I was in grad school for a long time, and I remember probably about a total of 15 minutes really clearly, 15 minutes cobbled together from a lot of different sort of episodes. And one thing that happened that I'll never forget, and it really sort of changed the way I thought about a lot of things. I was hanging out with my advisor and some other people from my cohort of incoming students, and we were arguing about some intellectual tradition in the Middle Ages. My advisor was a medievalist, as I was at the time. And one of the students said, well, people thought X, Y, and Z was happening, or we were talking about history of science and medicine. And he said, this is this and this and this and this. And my advisor says, well, name one. Give me one person who thought that. That was the end of the conversation. I ask that question all the time. And people tell me things, this is happening. A lot of people just name one. Give me one example. Often, that's the end of the conversation. People don't have one example of what they're talking about. Don't listen to them. Theme 2, the importance of history. Mike F. wrote, the meaning of history, is this something we're going to touch on in the second half? Or is it supposed to be open-ended? Yes, it's supposed to be open-ended. Yes, we talk about it in the second half. That's actually how we end the class. The last couple of weeks are really talking about what is history for? What should we do with it? What is it useful for? It's hard to talk about the meanings of history, and it will be a little easier after we read our third book, which really isn't about the meanings of history at all. But it tells us something about potentially what history can be and can't be used for. Meanings of history is tricky because it means so many things to different people. Some people think we should learn lessons from the past, so history doesn't repeat itself. I'm not in that camp. Some people think it's knowledge for its own sake, cultural sophistication, to just know what happened. I think historical sensibility is very important for a lot of different reasons. So there's a lot of things you can get out of history. For me, it's sort of just the critical analysis of argument and rhetoric and evidence and analysis and so on. Because those things you use in every field, in every job, in every career. If you're doing any kind of intellectual work, you need to know how to do these things. That's what historians do. That's why the study of history teaches you these things in different contexts, and you learn to ask really good questions. Hannah asked, why did these authors talk so little about the importance of history? Wouldn't it be worth learning more about history's lessons rather than merely going on about how historiography is developing? Yes, I agree. But I would say that one of the most important lessons from history, again, our subject in history in this class is history itself, right? The writing of history, the conversations about history. The most important thing we can take away from history is to learn about how history, as in the conversations about the past, are constantly evolving, and that our current histories are useful and right to us in the grand scheme of things, useful and right for us, and less so for anyone else that came before or after, right? People 100 years ago would not have benefited from our histories. People 100 years from now are not going to find as much utility in the histories that we're producing as they will in their own, right? That's just the basic thing. You don't get that view in most history classes where you're concerned about the past more than you are about historiography. Most college classes have an element of historiography and sort of the historical narrative sort of built in and how it's evolved. But often the focus is more on the past. What happened? What were people doing? Why were they doing it this way? What did it matter? How should we ask questions about it? How do we study it? And so on. So there is a historiographical element in most college history courses, but this is specifically about sort of a broad view of historiography. And that in itself, I think, is a very important history lesson to understand how the narratives of history are constantly changing. Hannah asked a very good question about morality. Shouldn't this be addressed as a part of historiography? And this is a great point because I don't talk about it. The books don't talk about morality explicitly. But I think it's very much already bound up and wound up in what different people in different times, different historians consider to be a good history. Again, early Christian histories in that tradition, Enlightenment histories that put different cultures at different points along a timeline of development of Western Europe. Those are moral choices about what constitutes good history. They're moral choices about what should be happening in the world, right? Whether it's following the Christian tradition or whether it's sort of a Renaissance rebirth of classical culture, whether it's Enlightenment philosophy about sort of progress and enlightenment, whether it's Rankian scientific history and social science approaches to history. These are all sort of moral choices, not only about how to do history methodologically, but also sort of what is the point of history? Like how should we base our future on the past, whether we follow it or deviate from it? And I think there's a lot of morality wrapped up in it, and it's been that way throughout the whole course, actually, to this point, even though we haven't talked about morality explicitly. But I think it's very good to say, yes, morality is a very strong aspect of historiography. You can think about the 1619 project that we just talked about towards the end of the first half. You could argue for the 1619 project or against the 1619 project based on your own version, your own moral imperative about telling American history in a certain way. Right? Even if you never mention the word morality or talk about it in a general sort of philosophical way, there's often that kind of sentiment. What is the moral imperative to sort of follow the traditional textbook approach of American history? What is the moral imperative to recenter it on a different group of people at this point, just as a way of offering a counter? Again, the 1619 project isn't meant to be a replacement for all of our existing historical interpretations, but as a complement to them. But that's a moral choice. So it's good to keep that in mind, that that's always happening, even if we don't have explicit conversations about morality. A couple of really great questions about professionalization. Who decides which history is worth publishing? Gabby asked a great question there. Chance, maybe we should dive deeper into historical research methods. Great points, great questions. There was a number of sort of related questions on sort of the professionalization or sort of how history gets written sort of at an academic level. We don't really get into these. Maybe we need an introductory sort of methods class to kind of complement this one. Historians are always limited by the kinds of archives they can visit, the kinds of materials they can access. Publishers and editors definitely have a hand in mediating and shaping history in the sense of conversations about the past by choosing what kinds of things get to enter that conversation. If you have a really crazy idea about history, no matter how well supported, how interesting it is, how meticulously researched it might be, if it's so bizarre, people are going to be reticent to publish it because it looks it can look like crazy. It looks really deviant and it looks irresponsible and it looks uninformed. I mean, it can, whatever adjective you want to use. So there is a real sort of check on sort of how fast history can change because you can't be too different, right? It's sort of a standard industry a quote in the food industry that products, if you want to introduce a new product, there's 20,000 new products in the supermarkets every year, 20,000 new things. And they have to be roughly, obviously it's impossible to totally quantify, 80% similar to existing products or consumers won't buy them because they think they're too weird and they're unwilling to try a totally new thing. They'll try a new variant on something they're already familiar with, but if it's too different, they won't buy it. So I think the same thing is true for history. If you're too weird, people are going to think you're nuts, and they're not going to listen to you. So changing the historical narrative, right? The 1619 project is a little too weird for a lot of people, right? It's too radical. So changing history, changing the narrative has to be done if that's your goal. It has to be done in a very strategic way because you have to navigate these real concerns about access to archives, geographically, politically, and you have to navigate sort of the publishing world or journalistic world of how are people going to get access to your ideas. Alexander asked, is academic versus popular history really that important? Is that debate useful or interesting? I think yes. That's a great question. I think the answer is yes because it speaks to the question of historical authority. Who is authorized to make knowledge about the past? Who is authorized to shape the conversation? Is it journalists like Nicole Hannah-Jones? Is it professional historians that worked at universities? Is it talented writers that read a lot of academic historical works and synthesize it in a really vibrant way that get people excited about the topic? Is it historians who are super specialized in one topic and one range of sources? Is it historians that study a huge range of things? There's a range of skills in both approaches. There are no matter what approach you take methodologically, there are people who are good at it and people who are not so good at it. How does all these different approaches and methods and professions get funneled into some kind of consensus about what happened in the past and what it means? And that's why I think the debates about academic versus popular history are very important because it tells us something. Just the debate and how people argue about it tells us something about how do we feel about who gets to create knowledge. The last theme I want to highlight is just a comparison of texts. Many of you commented on the key difference. I wanted you to think about the trade-off between a broad survey via Popkin versus critical questions and thematic groups in terms of Maza. So Popkin, obviously more historical and chronological and linear, right? That makes it a lot easier for some people. Maza is more focused thematically, but has to jump around chronologically. That makes more sense to some people because the questions resonate with them and the time period is less interesting. Other people like that security of the timeline, and it's just a lot easier to follow. It was really, just looking through your responses, about 50-50 in terms of who seemed to prefer what. But the hope is, as you might guess, that reading them both together helps you get more out of each book, no matter which approach you might prefer. Jordan asked if I personally favor one book over the other. I don't have favorites. I don't. I like everything for different reasons. I have some preferences. I don't have I don't favor one book over the other because I see them totally complementary. I like Maza's writing better. I think it's easier to read. Popkin is very sort of textbooky. It's kind of meant as a textbook in a way. I like how both have lots of examples. Both go into the weeds at times. I think Maza's footnotes and references to actual historical examples and citations and conversations about classic historical works far superior to what Popkin does. But it's also on a much smaller scope, so it's a little easier to do. I like Popkin's broad historical view. I think you get a very different sense of historiography and how the writing of history has changed over time that you can't get in Maza at all. But I think Maza is very much more useful for thinking about how to critically read history. Those questions in Maza you can ask about anything. I'll get to that in a second. Emily asked if historical thinking has managed to evolve so much in the past few centuries, could major changes be on the horizon to our historical thinking? Yes. Has to be, right? Is there any evidence that this trend of historiographical change is going to slow down or stop? No, I don't see any. I think historical methods, most salient to this question, will change to accommodate new volumes of historical information. Born digital archives, everything we produce is digital. That has its own challenges in saving stuff. But there's going to be more historians have access to. The historical record is increasingly digitized. Slowly, there's going to be a lot for a long time that's unavailable digitally. But as we have more information about the past, like say the 1990s, that's a relatively recent time for historians to study. Obviously, people do study that historically. But so that's going to be further and further away, right? So more historians are going to be looking at that time period for different reasons. And there's going to be a lot of digital stuff for them to sort through, right? Especially 2000, 2010. I mean, just think about everything is digital now. So when you have access to that, your methods as a historian need to change to accommodate that variety of information. We might see a resurgence in kind of a cliometrics approach. We might see a resurgence in very big picture history done on very massive information scales, which would be a very different kind of history from the storytelling that we've been reading about. And this shift is some way off. I think we're in the very early stages of it, and we probably won't see any palpable changes for maybe 20 years or 30 years, like a full generation of historians. But that change, to me, it seems to be on the horizon. Reese asked, what do I think is the most important shift in history? Again, don't have favorites. I don't have a most important thing. If I had to pick one, I would say the postmodern shift that we read about at the end of Popkin and was the focus of what Mazza was doing is maybe the most salient, in part because it's the most recent, but it's also a very profound philosophical shift in how do you think about the world, sort of decentering the nature of authority and decentering the nature of politics and thinking about everything in sort of very relative comparative terms. It's easy to think of that as the most significant shift, but that wouldn't have happened without the social science approach from the second generation of the Annales School in the early 20th century, right? The emphasis on demographics and the very positive approach to sort of a social science approach to historical knowledge. That wouldn't have happened without Ranke and sort of scientific truth. That wouldn't have happened without Romanticism and Enlightenment philosophical history. That wouldn't have happened with Rent. So you can keep going back and back and on and on and on. So everything builds on everything else. So it's hard to say, well, if you just start here, then everything would have happened anyway. Not really. It's constantly building. So it's hard to pick out one and say this is the most important because everything builds on everything else. Cassidy said, I would wonder if the writing of history has progressed more recently than in past centuries. Yes and no, right? Everything is constantly building. So it's easy to see the things that have happened most recently, postmodernism, and say this was the most important thing. But at the same time, we have to recognize sort of that continual nature of it. Natalie points out that politics of these books is in trying to justify an importance of history, which is exactly right. How do I think the political function of each differs? I think I've already kind of answered this in a way. It's the different historiographical scopes. And that's where you see the politics of what is history for these different authors. Popkin thinks history is to understand how the stories about the past, how history has changed in general. Helps us get a better sense of our own ways in which we create historical understanding and awareness. Why are people doing history? We see that in Popkin in a way you don't see in Mazza, and so on. Mazza is way more analytical and helps us think more critically about how modern histories are produced. So I think Mazza is much better for learning to analyze about history, and it's easier to do that with a wider sense of how things change over time, which is why we read the two books together. To conclude, a question from Nevaeh, how do I become a more critical student when learning history and be able to perceive things in a different way compared to just taking on information given to me about history? My answer is ask Mazza's questions. Ask yourself how what you're reading differs from the kind of histories we saw in Popkin. Ask the questions, history of whom, history of where, history of what? Who is it about? Who is excluded? What kinds of places, not necessarily specific geographies or cities or whatever, but what kinds of places is this talking about? What kinds of places are not relevant to this analysis, right? This kind of thinking is useful for any field, especially law, political science, we talked about politics earlier, policy work, right? Historical thinking and analysis, in addition to historical sensibility, in my view, some of the most important skills you can have because they apply to just about any kind of discourse, any kind of narrative. Okay, that's it for the first half of the class. I'm not going to say much about this week. It's pretty straightforward. You got the longish blog post. You got the bunch of very short essays in the Civil War Monitor. I'm asking you to compare their different approaches and give me your view on what we should do with architecture and Confederate monuments and things that sort of have this very ambivalent view about history, right? There's both good and bad reasons for keeping this stuff. And there's a lot of different ways about arguing about it. And that's what I want you to focus on in your response this week is not just what we should do, because everyone's going to have their own opinion, but how do we argue about it? How do we talk about it productively without just sort of talking past each other? Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.